Bad news for Ferrari in Brazil. If there is one team that we didn't expect to struggle as much as they did in Mexico, that has to be Ferrari. The Maranello team was unable to capitalize on anything throughout the Mexico GP, finishing in the same order in which they qualified. Nevertheless, the team's problems are likely to continue throughout the Brazilian GP, and we aren't expecting to see high competitiveness from Sainz and Leclerc again. So why will Ferrari struggle yet again in Brazil? Is this a sign that they are now giving up on the P2 spot in the Constructors' Championship too? Ferrari's qualifying pace in Mexico was alarming, and the Maranello team struggled to get decent times, with Sainz and Leclerc qualifying P5 and P6 respectively. What's even more disturbing is the fact that they weren't able to gain any time on their rivals ahead, Mercedes and Red Bull, with the Silver Arrow shedding more of the difference that Ferrari has for the P2 spot in the Constructors' Championship. This is something that was shared by Martin Brundle, Sky F1's pundit, who added, "The main intrigue was that both Red Bulls were on used soft tyres and both Mercedes were on new medium tyres on the grid, and for a while, as the Red Bull tyres began to cry enough, it appeared that Mercedes could run much longer at a reasonable pace and seize the initiative. Meanwhile, Ferrari was simply not at the races. They didn't have the pace despite having large amounts of downforce attached, and were clearly protecting something at these 7,200-foot altitude circuits, as they were destined to finish a minute behind. It goes without saying that nobody expected Ferrari to struggle as much, but if you compare their performance in Spa, you'd notice that they struggled there too. Not as much as they struggled in Mexico, with Sainz and Leclerc being able to finish higher in the qualifying session than Mexico. However, the race pace just wasn't there, and what's common for Mexico and Spa is the fact that both of them are high-altitude tracks. Charles Leclerc spoke about the disappointing GP in Mexico, adding, "It was incredibly difficult. We were just so slow, so yeah, we need to look at it. We were in the middle of nowhere. With Carlos, we were way slower compared to Mercedes and Red Bull, but much quicker than the midfield. So we were on our own, racing alone in a very lonely race. To be honest, there wasn't much we could have done more of." The upcoming GP is also a high-altitude one, and although it's not as high as Mexico, problems are still going to persist for Ferrari. The Maranello team is expecting to struggle yet again, but this time the competition will be even fiercer. Ferrari are slowly but surely losing the step for the P2 spot in the Constructors' Championship, and although many perceive the P3 spot to be a blessing in disguise for Mercedes, due to the fact that if the team finishes, it will receive an increased amount of wind tunnel time, they won't give up on the fight for the P2 spot. What's even more interesting is the fact that Mercedes are still pushing for the first win of the season, which is something that can be achieved here in Interlagos. But still, Leclerc's views on the Mexico GP say enough about where the team currently is. When talking after the race, the Monegasque called the race the worst one of the season so far, and hoped that it couldn't get any worse than this. I hope we won't be worse than this, because I don't expect any race to be worse than this. Along with Spa, it's probably one of the worst races. I honestly believe that it is a one-off. However, in order to improve in the future, we must first understand what we can do better in these conditions. Prior to the Mexican Grand Prix, Ferrari's main issue was tire degradation. However, in Mexico, this wasn't the situation, as the team struggled a lot when it came to running the engine at its optimum level. The altitude of the track was an enormous challenge for the Maranello team, and the fact that the next GP is also a high-altitude track goes to show that the struggles are likely to continue. True, the Mexican GP is around 2,285 meters above sea level, while the Interlagos GP is at 700, but the air is also rarefied in Brazil, just like it was in Mexico. But what's even more concerning is the fact that Binotto believes there is more to the puzzle when it comes to the high-altitude tracks, and the altitude itself isn't the only issue that the team is going to face in the Interlagos GP. In terms of power unit, we were not at our best performance for the weekend, but I don't think that's what explains it the most. That's part of the equation, but there is more than that. There is certainly more than that, and it's something that we need to look at, and there is not a clear answer right now. The ride was not great, the balance was not great. I'm pretty sure if I'm listening to the drivers later on in the debriefing, they will tell me that the car was not turning, and the reason why I think it has to be looked at, and we have no clear explanation right now. On the other hand, Binotto is really confident that his team will concede the P2 spot in the Constructors' Championship, and that the development rate of the Mercedes cars isn't something that's worrying him too much. While talking about this issue, Binotto said, "Mercedes is coming back. They've looked more competitive than we did here. We know we stopped developing our car early with a focus on 2023, and I'm not too disappointed. Let me say that I am concerned by the rate of development because I know when we stopped developing it." Although Ferrari has a negative spotlight for the race, Mercedes also has a negative spotlight. The Brackley-based team doesn't really believe that they'll be as competitive as they were in the previous race in Mexico and thinks that Ferrari will be much closer to the field. However, it's going to be a race full of rain, and we know that skills are often shown in the rain. Nevertheless, the performance of Mercedes isn't something that the Silver Arrows are hoping will be the same as it was in Mexico. And while talking about this matter, the Chief of Strategy, James Vowles, said, "I think this will really vary from track to track. Ferrari won't be as far away from us as they were in Mexico. They will be closer in Brazil and in Abu Dhabi, and it will be a very close fight between our two teams. In terms of relative strength to Red Bull, they still hold the edge relative to us. I don't think it is quite the 3/10 they outqualified us by, but it will be a few tenths across the next few races. It's really hard to tell before we get to an event, but I don't think we will quite enjoy the same level of competitiveness. It won't be much different, but it might be a slight step backwards, and I certainly expect Ferrari to be closer than they were in Mexico." Yet again, Mercedes could be deliberately stalling the progress that could bring them the P2 spot in the Constructors' Championship due to the fact that they will receive an increased time in the wind tunnels if they finish P3. Red Bull's penalty will result in a 10% reduction in time for 2023 for exceeding the budget cap in 2021, while Mercedes and Ferrari can desperately hope for in order to be closer to Red Bull in 2023. But the reality now is that Ferrari isn't expecting to deliver a good result in Brazil, and one huge factor in that is the altitude of the track and the overall performance of the engine. The Maranello team stopped with the upgrades and with the performance upgrades, which is why they've fallen a lot on the grid and gave up on the championship fight. That is, however, according to Ferrari. While talking about the improved pace of the W13, Vowles said that he expects the Maranello team to be much closer to the Silver Arrows in terms of pure pace, adding, "I think there are a few factors that came together at the same time. The first is that we put a large update kit on in Austin, and that did move us forward, and that evidence was even more present in Mexico. The second is that we are very good when we are running maximum downforce, and others are running maximum downforce as well, and that was evident in Zandvoort, in Budapest for example, and it was no different in Mexico. How it performs across the next two is hard to tell. Obviously, in the case of Mexico, it looked a little bit like Ferrari actually dropped back, and I suspect that that won't be the case as we move forward." With that being said, what do you think about Ferrari at Interlagos? Let us know in the comments below.